So, the topic for today's discussion is nose. We all know that the location of the nose is in the center of the face, and unlike the two eyes, we have one nose in the center. So, according to this picture, we can see that starting from above, just below the forehead is the root of the nose. The point of starting of the nose is the root of the nose. Then, as we go down, this raised part of the nose is called the dorsum or the bridge of the nose. And then this pointed part is the apex of the nose. And then these two parts are on either sides are called the ala of the nose, and then this part in the center is called the nasal septum, and the openings of the nose on the outside are called the nares or the nostrils. The various regions of the nose are that this blue one is the olfactory region lined by olfactory mucosa, and this brown one is the respiratory region which is lined with respiratory mucosa, and both these mucosa are histologically very different. Then this green part is the vestibule of the nose, and it contains short, coarse, rough hair called the vibrissae. The skeleton of the nose is both bony as well as cartilaginous. So the bony part in this picture, as we can see above, we have the nasal parts of the frontal bones here. Then in the center we have the nasal bones, and then on either sides of the nasal bones we have the frontal processes of the maxilla. This large bone is the maxilla. The processes that are going towards the frontal bone are the frontal processes of the maxilla, and they are forming part of the bony skeleton of the nose. So the bony skeleton of the nose, I'll repeat, are formed by the nasal part of the frontal bone, then the nasal bone itself, and then the frontal processes of the maxilla. Coming towards the cartilaginous part of the skeleton of the external nose, these are the lateral cartilages, one on either side, the alar cartilages, one on either side, and a nasal septum in the center, or the septal cartilage in the center. This picture summarizes the bony plus the cartilaginous part of the external nose skeleton. This gray one is the nasal part of the frontal bone. This yellow one is the nasal bone. This peach one is the frontal process of maxilla. Rest are the cartilages. This green is the lateral cartilage. This magenta one is the major alar cartilage. This red one is the minor alar cartilage. And this brown part is the fibrofatty tissue. Coming towards the boundaries of the nasal cavity. What is the nasal cavity? Nasal cavity is the part of the nose that is between the nostrils or nares in front and the nasopharynx behind. The area of the nose that is between these two openings, outside the opening is called the nostrils or nares, and posteriorly this opening is the nasopharynx, which opens into the pharynx. So in between these two openings is a cavity that is called the nasal cavity. We have two nasal cavities, one on either side of the nasal septum. So nasal septum divides the whole nasal cavity into two. Now, if we talk about one nasal cavity, each nasal cavity has a roof, a floor, a medial wall or nasal septum, and a lateral wall. The roof of the nasal cavity is formed from front by the nasal bone. After that is the frontal bone. After that is the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, and posteriormost is the sphenoid bone. So four bones are taking part in formation of the roof of the nose. First, I'll repeat, is the nasal bone, then the frontal bone, then the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, and finally the sphenoid bone. The floor of the nasal cavity is formed by two bones. In the front, we have the palatine process of maxilla, this red part, and behind we have the horizontal plate of the palatine bone, this purple part. Nasal septum or medial wall has the following bones forming. The first one is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, this yellow one. Posteriorly, we have the crest of the sphenoid bone, and below that we have vomer. Small part of the nasal crest of the palatine bone as well as the nasal crest of the maxilla also take part in formation of the septum. Anteriorly, we have septal cartilage. So the nasal septum or the medial wall of the nasal cavity is formed by mainly by the ethmoid, sphenoid, and vomer, and partly by the palatine bone and the maxilla. And the cartilage involved here is the septal cartilage. Here again, we can see that the bones involved are the ethmoid, the vomer, and the sphenoid, and the cartilage is the septal cartilage. Coming towards the features of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. Lateral wall has three concha and three meatuses, superior, middle, and inferior. Concha are the elevations and meatuses are the depressions or empty spaces beneath the concha. So above most is the superior concha, beneath is the superior meatus. Then is the middle concha, beneath which is the middle meatus, and below most is the inferior concha, and below inferior beneath this is the inferior meatus. So the lateral wall of nasal cavity is characterized by the three concha and their respective three meatuses. Coming towards the inferior concha, this one is the inferior concha. This is the largest most of the three concha. It is an individual bone and it is covered by the mucous membrane. If we talk about the middle and the superior concha, middle and superior concha are parts of a single bone, that is the ethmoid bone. So middle concha and superior concha combined are parts of the ethmoid bone, and inferior concha is a separate bone. Looking from front, these green parts are the three concha, superior, middle, and inferior, and the yellow ones are the meatuses beneath these concha. Now, if we talk about the inferior meatus, as I told you before, the meatus is the hollow space beneath a concha. So, it underlies the inferior concha, and the important point for this concha is that there is the opening of nasolacrimal duct here, which is guarded by a valve that is called the Hasner's valve. So, inferior concha is characterized by opening of the nasolacrimal duct, which is guarded by a valve that is called the Hasner's valve. In this picture, we can clearly see the specific features of the three meatuses. First of all, we discussed the inferior meatus, so I'll show you the inferior meatus here. This is the inferior meatus beneath the inferior concha, and it has opening of the nasolacrimal duct, this red spot. Then is the middle meatus. Middle meatus is the largest most area and it has the most prominent features of among the three meatuses. So if we look here, this is the middle meatus. Middle meatus has a swelling called the ethmoidal bulla. Ethmoidal bulla has middle and posterior ethmoidal air cells which form the ethmoidal sinus. So first sinus that is present in the middle meatus is the ethmoidal air sinuses, and it is present in the ethmoidal bulla. Beneath the ethmoidal bulla we can see a hiatus that is called the hiatus semilunaris. The hiatus semilunaris has openings for the frontal and maxillary air sinuses. So middle meatus has openings for three sinuses, the ethmoidal, frontal, and maxillary air sinuses. Now, if we talk about the here we can see that this is the middle meatus. This swelling is the ethmoidal bulla, which has opening for the ethmoidal sinus. Then this semilunar shaped hiatus is called the hiatus semilunaris. It has openings for the frontal and maxillary air sinuses. Now, in this picture again, we can see that this is the superior meatus. This one. Superior meatus has, this is the smallest, the shallowest, and it receives opening of the posterior ethmoidal air sinuses. So it doesn't have many characteristic features as apart from it has only the posterior ethmoidal air cells. Now above the superior meatus, superior we have a sphenoethmoidal recess which has opening for the sphenoidal sinus. In this picture we can summarize very well that coming from below upwards we have the inferior meatus having opening of the in nasolacrimal duct, this red colored spot. Then we talk about the middle meatus. It has openings for the frontal, maxillary, and ethmoidal sinuses. Then we have the superior meatus having the posterior ethmoidal sinuses. Then we have the superior sphenoethmoidal recess having the sphenoidal sinus. Now in this picture we can see that the nasal cavity is connected above, below and in the front with various structures. Above we have the orbital cavity, and the communication between the nasal cavity and the orbit is through the ethmoidal air sinuses. Below we have the maxillary sinus, and the connection is through the maxillary air sinuses. In the front, the nasal cavity is connected with the nasolacrimal duct and the lacrimal sac. We have four paranasal sinuses, as I've told you before: the sphenoidal sinus, the maxillary sinus, the ethmoidal sinus, and the frontal sinus. As I told you before, the sphenoidal sinus opens into the sphenoethmoidal recess, the maxillary sinus opens into the middle meatus, the ethmoidal sinus anterior and middle open into the middle meatus, the posterior one into the superior meatus, the frontal sinus also opens into the middle meatus. Now, the neurovascular supply of nose is very important. I'll tell you this neurovascular supply of the nose in the next lecture. So stay tuned. And if you have any questions, you can ask me in the comment section. I'll try my level best to answer you, satisfy you as I can, as well as I can.